let's kick off with developing news on Stop the Bets, Betting Gate, gambling, whatever we want to call it. The Conservative Party have finally taken the action today to suspend the two candidates who are accused
very belatedly. It had become completely absurd. I was talking to Kevin Hollingrake yesterday, the Post Office Minister, and I said, if you are in one of these two constituencies, is it North West Bristol and Montgomeryshire, I think, and your postal vote comes in, what should you do? And he said, well, it's very, very difficult. I don't quite know because, of course, they might well, if they're found guilty, they might well not be Conservative MPs even if you voted them in. So the proposition would be you might vote for a Conservative, you might not vote. The whole thing had become absurd. Keir Starmer has been rightly saying that if they had been Labour candidates, their feet wouldn't have touched the ground, they'd have been out. And Rishi Sunak dithered, hid behind the Gambling Commission, and then suddenly announced, only yesterday I think it was, that there was going to be an internal Tory party inquiry, and that led us to think, well, an internal Tory party inquiry a few days before an election, will it actually tell us anything useful, or the voters, more importantly, anything useful before the election? No. And so finally, very, very late, far too late, they've bowed to the inevitable. It's just another example of appalling party management during this campaign.
Because it was inevitable, wasn't it? When even it was just Craig Williams who has confessed to having a flutter, making this bet, £100 I think it was. It should have happened straight away, shouldn't it? We've talked about it time and time again on the podcast.
Well, all the party leaders have faced impossible to answer questions during this campaign. And for Rishi Sunak, one of the ones was, why did you not pick up the phone and ask Craig whether he had laid a bet or not? He's your aide, you know him. Why did you not do that? And he did not have an answer for it.
Well, But Craig Williams has said that he laid the bet. Laura Saunders, we haven't had a comment from her, I don't think.
So what was the rest of the investigation? He, a proper leader, frankly, could have sorted this out within about 35 seconds.
What do you think finally switched it for him?
I think just the endless pressure. They thought this story would go away. What an election campaign does is it accelerates all stories. So stories explode across the media, and then a day later they vanished again. And he clearly hoped this was going to be one of those, and it wasn't. No,
and we're still faced with the prospect that there might yet be more names that come out. Accusations today that the Metropolitan Police have been leaking names to the media, something they've denied. But do you think we are going to get more details? Does this draw any kind of line under it?
I don't know whether we get more details. I think the only important thing about this story really is that it completely confirms a widespread public suspicion that current Conservatives are in it for themselves. They don't have a broad and generous concern for the interests and the problems of ordinary people. They're in the game for themselves, and they think one set of rules applies to them. And this scandal reminded everybody far too vividly of Partygate, as indeed I think one Michael Gove said.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a hard-working Tory candidate knocking on doors day after day, you'd be absolutely furious. I mean, we shouldn't tarnish everybody with this, but you'd
and
absolutely outrageous.
All these decent, normal Conservative Party volunteers and workers, trundling up and down streets, knocking on doors, stuffing envelopes, not doing it for any personal emolument or grandeur, but because they think it's the right thing to do. They're the people who have been most let down by this disgraceful scandal.
Yeah. Your penultimate column this week for the New Statesman before next week's election, just 9 days to go. You've been writing about, well, quite a lot.
So, spoiler alert, my overwhelming sense in this final spurt of the campaign is that Labour is going to win and win big, by which I mean a majority of well over 100. That's what I think. But this week I've tried to look at things that might mitigate that and might reduce the scale of the Tory defeat. And I've looked at three things. One of them is the voter suppression story, which is the extent to which the Conservatives are successful at persuading people this election is all over, it's finished. Nigel Farage has said, you might as well go home, it's all done. Labour has won and won big. And that will persuade quite a lot of people not to vote. So that's one thing. But there are two, as it were, wrinkles, I think, in the story of Tory total collapse and Labour total victory at the moment. One is about gender, we can talk about that, and the other one is about Nigel Farage.
So why don't we start with Nigel Farage, because this has been rumbling on since he spoke with BBC's Nick Robinson. That interview was broadcast last Friday night. And really, support that he has been getting from some of the right-wing press has dwindled since. What did he say?
So he has always said, I'm not an appeaser, and Putin is doing terrible things in this war in Ukraine, but he thinks the West provoked this. In particular, the EU by trying to expand eastwards, NATO by trying to expand eastwards, and he said, if you poke the Russian bear with a stick, don't be surprised by its reaction. Now, that absolutely infuriated Boris Johnson, who came straight back saying this is ahistorical twaddle and classic Kremlin appeasement and all of that. And Farage, he jumped on top of a bus and accused Boris Johnson of doing much the same thing back in 2016, holding up a big newspaper front page where Boris Johnson was accused of appeasing or being pro-Putin by complaining about the EU's imperial eastward expansion. More or less the same thing that Nigel Farage had said. So the two men are just exchanging more and more extreme insults. You know, Farage called him the worst British Prime Minister ever, and so on. And this is really interesting to me because there is a narrative which sees the rise of reform and cheeky chappy Nigel Farage with his pint in one hand being able to speak so fluently to Middle Britain as irresistible. I think it is not irresistible, and I think Conservative England will have two big problems. One is about foreign affairs, Farage's readiness to talk with Putin, to do a negotiation, to do a deal, which he also talks about now, which would in practice mean Putin keeping a big slice of Ukraine and be a big win for Putin. That's the real problem with what Farage has been saying. And also his enthusiasm for Donald Trump. I think there's an awful lot of Daily Telegraph, Daily Mail reading Middle Britain Conservatives who do not like either Putin or Trump. And Farage can't move beyond a certain area there. And then the second problem he's got is over history. So Nigel Farage appeals to very, very effective and very strongly sort of nostalgic post-Second World War British patriots. People like me, in a sense. I lost a lot of members of the family in the war, and I was brought up with sort of badly glued Spitfire hanging from my bedroom ceiling, and perhaps one too many volumes of war memoirs around the house. People like that. And, they're all across Hampshire and the South Coast and the rest of it. You see them in lots of little market towns, chaps with their sort of claret-coloured corduroys wandering into model shops. And I'm not sneering at it because I am slightly in that direction myself. I do understand the strong sense of nostalgia about the years when we were all together, we were fighting a great evil and we did extraordinary things as a country. But you can't appeal to that and have lots of candidates who think Adolf Hitler was a damn good fellow, And there are people who are outright pro-Nazis who have, emerged as Reform UK candidates. And I know that Nigel Farage says we haven't vetted them all and they should be chucked out and the rest of it. But nonetheless, the door was open and they have come in, and that's a big problem.
Well, and presumably they thought they'd be welcome and at home in that party.
They did. And Farage has got to be really, really ruthless at kicking them out if he's going to be advancing much further. And this is all very relevant to the election coming, very soon now, because obviously a lot of these polls predicting an absolute Conservative wipeout are predicated on Reform UK advancing very strongly among Conservative voters. So when you get the Daily Telegraph and you get the Daily Mail, referenced himself by Nigel Farage, it's clearly got under his skin, attacking him over the Putin stuff, and the candidates, and the Times doing the same thing, that must give pause for thought.
Our colleague David Gauke, who was obviously once a Conservative MP, sees some hope actually in these comments from Nigel Farage. He writes today in the New Statesman, he said this past week was the moment when Farage's attempt to become the undisputed leader of the right in the UK faltered. And if so, that's good news for the centrist Conservatives after all. He doesn't think that this will particularly affect how people vote next week, but actually it's good news for the Conservatives.
I think David Gauke puts it much more elegantly and crisply than Andrew Marr did. It's absolutely right. This is a big moment. This is Boris Johnson versus Nigel Farage about who is going to be the next leader of the right. And the truth is it might well be neither of the above. It might well be somebody from inside the Conservative Party who makes it back in after this election, like Kemi Badenoch. But
also quite striking that Kemi Badenoch has actually constantly kept the line that Nigel Farage would not be welcome. But Priti Patel now saying this as well.
It's a big division inside the Tory party. Suella Braverman has been pro-Farage coming back in, as it were. But Priti Patel, who was dancing, we may remember, with Nigel Farage at the Conservative Party conference last year, what a long time ago it now seems, is on the same side as most, I think, the rest of the senior Conservatives. The person I would look to, by the way, for a very, very plausible next Conservative leader from the sort of centre right would be James Cleverly. I think he's very badly underpriced at the moment.
He made comments, he was alleged to have made comments at the weekend that he was counting himself out, didn't he?
Not on camera, he didn't.
Okay.
On camera, he left the door sufficiently ajar, I would say. These are issues for after the election. Mm-hmm. Let's think about the election, that kind of thing. He has got good reasons. His wife has been very ill, and he's put a lot into two big jobs recently. He's served all the way through the tumult, including under Boris Johnson and so on. So I could see lots of reasons for him not to do it. But in terms of sort of eloquence, steel, and a very strong anti-Labour rhetoric, he'd be a very powerful leader of the Conservatives in opposition, I think.
The second element that you've mentioned that could dent Labour's majority stems back to this criticism from J.K. Rowling at the weekend that they haven't got their act together when it comes to women's same-sex spaces and trans rights. We went into this in quite some detail yesterday, so we won't go over the detail of the criticism, but why is this so important, do you think, for Labour, and why is it potentially so damaging? Clearly,
there are quite a lot of eloquent, relatively well-known feminists who just think the Labour position is intolerable. Another one would be Joan Smith, who was a colleague of mine way back in various newspapers and was on the New Statesman for quite a long time as well. Not a well-known name perhaps these days, but quite well-known inside the Labour family for all sorts of reasons, and she has, as it were, torn up her Labour Party card over this. So I think there are a group of people who feel very, very strongly about it, but I think the much bigger problem is the sense that Keir Starmer has been sort of Weasley about it, has not been explicit and clear, has changed his position, hasn't backed people like Rosie Duffield when he really should have done. And that plays into the character question. Will he change his mind? Can we trust what he says? That's why I think it matters. And there's this fear, another journalist at the weekend, Matthew Syed, wrote very, very punchy piece saying, can we trust Labour to stand their ground? Say they come out now, and I know there's been attempts to appease J.K. Rowling and other women saying, no, we get this and we understand the importance of women-only spaces. But there is that fear that words mean little when they've backtracked on so many other things, and all it would take is for things to get a little bit difficult, a few people shouting, and then they would give in again. You could only be secure in holding the line, as it were, whether it's against revisionists in our history, whether it's against the more extreme climate protesters, whether it's against the trans rights people chasing women down the streets of Brighton screaming fascist at them from behind their hooded faces. Whether it's, you can only stand clearly if you know what you think and you're determined to hold the line. And at this stage, I think that the Labour leadership generally, but including Keir Starmer, has not been explicit and eloquent enough about what they think about some of these issues. I don't think it is the culture wars, but it is a values fight. It's a fight about values and about temperament, and I don't think they've been explicit enough. Those two things, let's bring them together then, and we're looking at the potential size of a Labour majority. No one is doubting that they're going to win. Do you think this idea of this word that's emerged in the last fortnight or so, supermajority, has it harmed Labour? Do you think the polls they've dominated so much this election campaign, haven't they? I think there is absolutely no evidence that this, un-British and ahistorical word supermajority, which does not refer to anything that might happen in the House of Commons, is meaningless. It just means a big majority. Yeah. I think warnings about a big majority, which I might say we on the New Statesman were warning about, was saying was going to come up as a Tory tactic about 4 weeks ago. I don't think that's changing things, because I think for everybody who thinks, oh, well, there's no point in voting, Labour are going to get in by a big place, therefore I don't need to bother, the people being targeted right now by Labour social media adverts. There's at least one person who wants to be on the winning side. And it's a moment of history, the moment when the Conservatives were sort of smashed and all the rest of it. So I don't think it's really damaged them. But I do know that a lot of people around the top of the campaign and Starmer are genuinely concerned that a Conservative and right-wing sort of campaign or policy of trying to persuade people that the election has in effect already happened. You don't need to bother to go out on July the 4th. And this repeated message, you won't get change unless you vote for it, shows they're concerned. Are you expecting a low turnout, do you think? I think there will be quite a low turnout, but I think Labour the way Labour has focused on different seats, and the under-discussed and under-reported sort of under-the-table deal between Labour and the Liberal Democrats, which means that Labour has pulled out of, about 60 or 80 seats the Lib Dems could win, means that I think the Conservatives will be absolutely smashed, but on an overall low turnout. And that is, of course, quite dangerous, because that suggests a very, very volatile political situation, which may well turn against Labour quite quickly after the election.
Oh, and a generally disillusioned public.
There's no way through this but for Labour to win and then deliver. They have to deliver for ordinary people on education, on health and waiting lists, on crime, and on the border. They have to do these things. And if they don't, then I think the revenge will be horrible. Another
issue that you raise in your essay this week is about media support this election. And it's quite interesting, the Times in particular, obviously that blistering J.K. Rowling essay, that's a personal attack on Keir Starmer, not just the party, was in the Times on Saturday. They've gone again, today's front page is on a very similar theme against Labour. Labour have really wanted to win over the Times, haven't they?
Well, Matthew Doyle, who's the head of communications for Keir Starmer, has spent basically the last 2 years giving every story he possibly can to the Times, giving the Times every piece of access, everything he can do to win over the Murdoch empire, just as Tony Blair did before 1997. But this time with, so far, very little success. And I think part of the trouble he has is that Tony Gallagher, who is the editor of The Times, is not a natural Labour Party supporter, to put it mildly. And I think on the side of the Sun, Rebecca Brooks remembers very, very well Keir Starmer's role when they were going after the Sun and Sun journalists during the Leveson period. And so, they've spent a lot of capital, not just on the Times, but on offending quite a lot of their natural supporters in places like the BBC and Newsnight and elsewhere. And, it may not pay off. And I think what Labour have to remember, and I put this gently, is that the time will come in government, not too far away, when they will need their friends. And if they look around and their friends in the media aren't there because of the way they've been treated, that will be a problem.
Do you think yesterday Harry Cole and Rebecca Brooks were questioned by Victoria Derbyshire? There was a bit of cheekiness in their response. Do you think there's any sign the Sun will back Labour?
I think it's possible. I think it's possible that both the Sun and the Times eventually will say, look, this Conservative government has been disgraceful and a failure, and we cannot support voting Conservative, but we do not trust Keir Starmer and we do not like some of the things they're doing. So we are going to be agnostic. We are going to say, vote according to your conscience, and we are going to hold our fire and hold the next government to account as we've held the last one to account. I think that's what they may well say. We'll see.
Good news for them in Scotland, though, today.
Very, very good news for the Labour Party in Scotland. The Daily Record, which used to be, as it were, the Daily Mirror for Scotland, a rambunctiously punchy pro-Labour paper in Scotland, then fell away from Labour and went to the SNP, as had many of its readers. And this week it's come out, all guns blazing, for Labour again. I think that is very good news for Labour in Scotland, because that will be a crucially important part of the election campaign.
How important generally are newspaper endorsements? Does it make any difference?
Now we get on to the really meaty bit of this. Increasingly unimportant. It's interesting, as we're talking, neither the Sun nor the Times have endorsed anybody. And in campaigns I've covered all the way going back to the 1980s, the moment when the Times or the Sun or the Mail came out for one side or another, in the case of the Mail, you kind of knew what was going to happen. It was a big moment, and people would react to it and notice it. I'm not absolutely sure that's the case now. I think partly because there's a sense that we all know the way the election's going. It's not going to change the narrative. It's more about deals and agreements between proprietors and owners and politicians than it is about the narrative. But also, so many people, a vast majority of people, get their news from their phones or their laptops or whatever. And the number of people who click from a news headline online to the traditional newspaper, which provided the headline, is absolutely minuscule.
What can we expect in this final week before polling day?
The relentless repetition of wearisomely familiar messages, I think, is what we can expect. Everybody is tired. The journalists are tired. The politicians are shattered. The leadership groups are exhausted. They know the lines to take. Labour are just desperate that they don't suddenly drop a big ball on tax or Europe or something else. So they're going to be pretty disciplined and tight-lipped. They've been disciplined, remarkably disciplined, all the way through, and they've withstood extraordinarily aggressive media pressure all the way through. So they'll just carry on like that. I don't know what the Conservatives do. They have almost given up. We're talking on the day that the Japanese emperor is in town and Rishi Sunak is grabbing with both hands, probably his last opportunity to be on the international stage in that way.
To be fair, I don't begrudge him the day off.
I don't think anybody does. I would have spent the last few weeks, if I had been Rishi Sunak, under the table, gnawing my knuckles and wailing.
In a way, I admire his resilience and his keeping going.
Yes, it is. I mean, it's slightly inhuman almost, but it is, I guess, admirable. It is, he's sticking by his message. He's not giving up. Everybody around him is giving up, but he is not.